Okay, folks, welcome to my review of Rippaverse's first anthology book, Saints and Sinners. You ever wanted to be disappointed by Rippaverse 6 times in rapid succession? Holy is this the book for you? You're going to get full spectrum failure from this book, because as the back cover says, inside these pages are action, adventure, intrigue, mystery, drama, heartbreak, demons, evil, violence, wins, losses, and even murder. Because murder's a big deal, you know. Whereas demons? We see demons all the time. Demons is small potatoes, right? Now, if you think placing demons lower in the hierarchy indicates that whoever edited this book might not have their priorities straight, I'm not going to argue with you, because in my opinion, an editor's first priority should be quality. And the first page of the first story in the book already indicates to me that quality was not job one here. The story is Chasing Ghosts by writer Az of the YouTube channel HeelVsBabyface and penciler Diogenes Neves, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, and we find ourselves motoring right into a hail of missteps. Starting with this amazing bit of hand-holding, where either the writer or the editor decided readers are too stupid to know that by default, every story starts now. I guess they figured that level of understanding would require the kind of intelligence that would have made you pass on this book in the first place. Add to that some spelling and punctuation problems. You're supposed to spell out the word okay and put a comma after it. And then add on top of that the fact that this page is a complete waste of time. The point of beginning a story with a splash page like this is to convey a sense of danger from the get-go, but you know what doesn't convey danger? A completely nonchalant attitude on Ingrid Valdez's part, conveyed in her statement, "Okay, Ingrid, time to earn that paycheck." This line has all the excitement of a snooze button. I mean, for f***'s sake, you didn't even give it an exclamation point. Not to steal your own shtick, Az, but you're boring! We then jump from that useless scene to before, because that's helpful. Could be 2 weeks ago, could be 2 hours ago, but let's just call it before. We're outside the police department watching Detective Callie Briggs and Chief Holcomb have an argument apparently somewhere across the street. Why they want to air this dirty laundry in public is anybody's guess, as is why the detective's hair color changes every single Rippaverse comic she's in. Oh wait, turns out the argument is going on inside the police department after all, which means the Rippaverse version of Texas is as concerned about smoking indoors as the Rippaverse itself is concerned about hair color consistency or grammatical sense, because this sentence is gibberish. We've got a mountain of dead bodies with bullet holes, broken necks, and 2 dead mob bosses without a scratch on them. Okay, dead bodies can have bullet holes and broken necks, but they cannot have their own mob bosses. Mob boss is not a valid dead body accessory. This comma should be the word and this comma should be removed. This is like the devil himself came to collect the debt. It needs to be conjuncted to the previous balloon's final thought with an and. Notice also how Holcomb's doing all the talking in this panel, but Briggs has got her mouth open like she's waiting for someone to stuff a ball gag in it. Finally, their argument is interrupted, and here's where the artist decides to get cutesy-poo and create 4 panels where only 2 are needed. Can you please f*** off with this goofy nonsense? Especially since you didn't remember to match the lower half of the door's pattern on the other side. Just drop this dialogue balloon lower and close up these gaps. Next, we jump to Alpha Core's Eagle's Nest, currently situated right next to the police station due to the events of Alpha Core number 1. Ingrid Valdez is summoned to the same crime scene as Briggs and decides to take her new bike out for a spin. Sandy tells Valdez, "Don't crash it like Eagle's Nest," which is a completely bitchy thing to say because Eagle's Nest's crashing wasn't Valdez's fault at all. Rippaverse's stupid Superman Brian Solari was the moron who made that happen. We're then introduced to Valdez's fancy bike, the Apex, in this little panel where we're barely able to make out the bike. And I would say that if you really needed to eat up a whole page of your story on a cool-looking splash moment, showcasing Valdez riding her new scooter here would have been the way to do that. No bullets required. When Valdez arrives at the crime scene, Briggs gives her some guff about the bike, so Valdez says, "You offering to ferry me around, Detective Briggs?" Now it's Briggs' turn to get bitchy and hand Valdez a cheap shot, saying, "After what happened to the last guy, I think I'll pass." Briggs is referring to Guy Wilkins, who was Valdez's cop cabbie in Alpha Core number 1. Valdez didn't actually play a role in Wilkins' death other than to tell him it's possible for minor accepts like him to strengthen their powers over time. Based on that information, he burned himself out saving police headquarters. You can tell Valdez is stung by Briggs' remark, though, so she might be thinking, if only I hadn't told Wilkins it was possible to get stronger, maybe he'd still be alive. Of course, then everybody in police headquarters would have been dead, but it's not like the Rippaverse is big on logic. As Valdez and Briggs investigate the crime scene together, Valdez takes an opportunity for some bitchy retaliation and complains about Briggs' smoking. Who even smokes these days? Well, unless smoking is punishable by death in Rippaverse, Texas, odds are a lot of people still smoke these days, you idiot, same as in our world. Would even say something like this. Thought Az hated Karens, but he's sure writing Valdez as one. Now we come to my favorite line in the whole story. The door was locked from the inside when we arrived. We had to force it open. Looks to me like you forced the whole wall open, officer. Especially since the door's over there. Valdez and Briggs explore more of the crime scene outside, and suddenly Valdez realizes someone's watching them. Could it be the killer? Valdez uses her whips to spring up to the roof and finds Sydney Bloodruth, whom Ingrid calls by her full name because we've all agreed to give up on believable dialogue, right? After warning Ingrid that what the police are chasing is actually a vengeful spirit, Bloodruth strikes a pose in front of a metaphorical blood moon that only the reader can see because actual storytelling, we're just drawing we think looks cool now. Bloodruth then uses a little bit of her blood on a locator spell that places Ingrid's quarry at the docks. Ingrid hops on her bike and drives 100 miles an hour into oncoming traffic. It's not Valdez's fault, though, because all these cars are driving in the wrong direction, as these signs clearly indicate. Apparently in Rippaverse, Texas, cars just sometimes stampede against traffic like frightened cattle. We'll just set that aside, too. At the docks, a couple of mercenaries on their last legs named Maya and Noah discover a shipping container with a painted smile on it that contains the dead body of their teammate Lucas. I will give the artist some props here because even though we're looking at this scene from far away, both the sense of dread of suspecting what's in the container and the anguish the characters display in the reveal are spot on. You really feel every agonizing, tragic moment of these two panels. Maya then bursts into blue energy and tells Lucas's corpse that it's time he was made whole. And the chaos that ensues informs Noah that he'd better take up a defensive position. We finally catch up with Now, as we realize Noah is the shooter, who's pelting Ingrid's bike with bullets. Oh look, you remembered the comma between OK and Ingrid this time. Still didn't spell out OK, though. Ingrid wipes out her bike in this panel that has me saying, which is it? Did she wipe out with her bike, or did she spring into the air using her whips? Because you can't have it both ways. A bunch of pointless quiet fighting ensues, until Ingrid is surprised from behind by the ghost of Lucas, who lets rip an icy cold fart from his ghost crotch or something. Seriously, who the f*** can tell what's happening here? Actually, that ripping sound is the sound of Ingrid's soul getting ripped out of her by Lucas's ghost. The rip sound effect was drawn too high on the page. The soul ripping only stops when Maya tells Lucas, "Aw, hell no, you ain't trading me for that skank." Lucas comes crawling back like the beta orbiter he is, and then the ostensibly 3 mercenaries teleport away, leaving Lucas's body to spontaneously combust. This last little sequence of action is a bit clumsy, because this line here intentionally forms such a natural panel boundary that it's easy to misread this sequence as 4 panels instead of the actual 3. This shouldn't be an inset panel either, so remember my rule. If you can tell the story using conventional storytelling techniques, do so. The artist's job is to tell the story, not be unnecessarily flashy about it. Last, we get a couple of flubs in the story's denouement, where Ingrid is speaking to the grave of Guy Wilkins while sitting with her back against a tree that, considering Wilkins' intact body was buried in a coffin, must be sitting right on top of Wilkins' legs. Never mind how or why they put a tree on top of him in the first place. You know the drill by now. So far as the dialogue in this section goes, I don't think I would have put emphasis on it, and for sure I would have eliminated the will ya and moved this bubble to the next panel. The last 2 panels introduce a brand new character who's some sort of spectral jester. For lack of a better name, I'm going to call him Az-Clown. I'm guessing Az-Clown is the reason there's a big grin painted on the shipping container holding Lucas's dead body. Another reason I think Az-Clown is integral to the story rather than just a throwaway last-second addition is that on the Chasing Ghosts cover of Saints and Sinners, you can see Az-Clown's face reflected in Ingrid's helmet. That's pretty much it for Chasing Ghosts. Now, if I had been handed the story as an editor, here are a few large-scale things I would have done differently. First, of course, I would have swapped out this useless splash page at the beginning for a cool splash page in the middle of the story showing off Ingrid's bike as she rides it for the first time. Next, I would have gotten rid of the opening scene with the argument between Briggs and Holcomb, largely because Holcomb ends the argument with an ultimatum to Briggs, saying, "You better make this freak call work." So you'd think Briggs would be on some sort of best behavior around Valdez. But not only does she make no effort to be anything but oil to Valdez's water the whole time they're together, but also the moment Valdez spots Bloodruth, Briggs drops out of the picture entirely and doesn't reappear until the final scene, where they're just as standoffish to each other as before. If nothing was ever going to change between these two, then the story should have just started with Ingrid getting the call to meet Briggs at the crime scene, and any background we needed to understand the case could have been explained by Briggs to Valdez at the scene. Last, the ghosts needed a bit more backstory than what we got. Instead of them all just teleporting away, they could have given Ingrid a little explanation of who they were, just to apologize for all the mess they'd caused. We leave the story not even knowing why they killed all those mobsters, or even if they killed all those mobsters. Maybe some of the mobsters were killed by Asclown. It's impossible to say. You had at least 4 panels of pointless fighting. Maybe you could have had Noah lay out the basics then. Plus, there was room to explore some empathy between the hunter and the hunted, in that the ghosts are obviously distressed at Lucas's passing, and Ingrid is still sad about Wilkins' passing. Chasing Ghosts would have been a pretty good story if only it weren't packed with the same quality control problems Rippaverse has become legendary for. Scarce information, fluff scenes, technical issues at every level, and the same lack of editorial talent you just can't replace with a writer who thinks his complaining about comics so long makes him part of the solution and not just more of the problem. All that being said, Az's debut as a comics writer isn't that bad. His team of ghosts, at least, is an interesting contribution to the Rippaverse that could go far if only they were the property of a comic book company worth a damn. Okay, folks, welcome to my next review dealing with Rippaverse's first anthology book, Saints and Sinners. Today we're looking at the story A Cross to Bear by writer J. David and interior artist Chris Bolson. As the corresponding variant cover for Saints and Sinners shows, the story is about an unconscious guy lying in the middle of the street in present-day Florist Park. As with the previous story, Chasing Ghosts by HeelVsBabyface, we're unnecessarily told that this story is set in the present day. But I confess that due to one of Rippaverse's most famous screw-ups, which I'll be bringing up later, knowing for sure that we're dealing with now is actually helpful for this story. So our protagonist wakes up lying in the middle of the street for no reason, with no idea where he is, no idea who he is, and definitely no idea why his hands are going snap, crackle, pop. Right then he happens upon a mugging in an alley, and instead of jumping in to save the day like we'd expect from any typical comic book protagonist, he instead flashes back to the good old military days where he literally could not care less about muggings or any other kind of crime, as evidenced by the fact that he's ordered to go on a genocidal killing spree in some anonymous Middle Eastern village, and he has absolutely no problem carrying out his orders. Yes, that's him literally slaughtering the woman and her children. He's snapped back from his reverie by the sound of one of the muggers calling him Cross. Actually, the muggers just want the gold cross around our protagonist's neck. Our protagonist responds with a roundhouse kick that's somehow both fast enough and powerful enough to knock down both muggers at once. Then he asks them, "What did you call me?" Because he also appears to have forgotten how he dressed himself today. They're not talking about your name, buddy. They're talking about your jewelry. Right then, the police arrive, so everyone except our protagonist evacuates the scene. At this point, it looks like 2 cop cars pull up, but I think the artist's intent was to show a single car, initially coming in on the left and then making a U-turn to end up in the center, because for the rest of this police encounter, we never see any cops besides these 2 cops or any cop car besides the one visible here. So the leftmost cop says they got a call about a fight breaking out, and if you're not paying attention, you're probably going to think, as I did at first, that the cop is referring to the brief altercation between our protagonist and the muggers. But that's impossible. There's no way some onlooker witnessed this roundhouse kick, decided to call 911, went and got a phone, called 911, gave the dispatcher the location information, and then the dispatcher gave this info to the cops, who had to take the dispatcher's call, all in the at most 30 seconds that transpired between the roundhouse kick and the cop's arrival. I suspect what this cop is actually referring to is whatever fight laid out our protagonist in the middle of the street and cost him his memory. But whatever the case, the cop tells our protagonist in the usual cop way to stop right where he is. But our hero says, "You're not the boss of me!" And he actually tackles the cop, while the cop's partner draws his taser. And here the artist and editors show that Rippaverse still doesn't understand how to properly use inset panels. This inset panel is not only horribly dull and positioned a little too far left to properly sequence its place in time, but it's also totally unnecessary, and I can almost guarantee you how it got here. Originally, there was no inset panel. You just had the protagonist crashing into the one cop while the other cop looks on. But then the next panel shows our hero getting tased by the other cop, and this led somebody to wonder, when did the other cop draw his taser? Are Rippaverse readers smart enough to realize the cop must have drawn his taser between panels? That somebody apparently didn't think so and ordered the artist to draw an inset panel explaining the obvious. So remember, the next time Rippaverse tells you, we don't hold our readers' hands, sometimes they totally do. Anyway, our boy gets tased, and that causes him to go all Sparky McSparkerson, so the cops take him to the hospital and strap him to a bed. When he wakes up, he's surrounded by none other than Mick Davies and 2 men in black. Davies takes the 2 men in black out into the hall to discuss things, and here's where we learn that in present-day Florist Park, Mick Davies is a detective. I guess after being such an abusive boss and botching his handling of Yaira's return, he got busted down to detective from his previous role as chief of police.
Yeah, Mick Davies is a white police chief.
So it looks like we can safely say we're down to 2 Mick Davies in the Rippaverse now, with the police chief having been busted back down to detective. Whether this white detective Mick Davies will ever meet his black detective Mick Davies counterpart from Horseman Welcome to Florispark remains to be seen. Anyway, as Davies and the men in black bicker in the hallway, our protagonist uses his electrical powers to pull a Houdini, because that's just how physics work in the Rippaverse. Then our boy eats up an entire splash page, jumping through the hospital window to escape, because why waste a page on, I don't know, telling an actual story, when you can just show your character performing some dramatic act surrounded by broken glass and lightning? By the way, do you remember that other Rippaverse book where the main character escapes from a hospital? This story is so original. Now, because this razor-thin hospital room door is somehow completely soundproof, nobody in the hallway heard the glass-shattering escape take place, so the sheer surprise prompts Detective Davies to finally ask the million-dollar question: who is this guy? The men in black decide, what the heck, let's throw all our secrets out the busted window too. And that's when we find out our protagonist is a cyborg named Cameron Cross. That's right, his honest-to-God last name is Cross. Our protagonist actually had reason to think the muggers were calling him by name and not just demanding his jewelry. How serendipitous is that? I bet in the next Rippaverse anthology he gets a piano dropped on him and we find out his middle name is Steinway. So Cross ends up finding a church, taking some donated clothes, and kneeling before the altar praying for anyone to help him remember who he is. As he's praying, a man stands off in the distance. Who is the man? It's Buddy Christ. Nah, just kidding. We don't actually find out who the man is because the story just ends right there. Seriously, any hope you had of a satisfying plot resolution gets sucked right into the black hole of artistic incompetence, which makes this excerpt from J. David's dedication page particularly galling. It's an honor to have the opportunity to create and write for Cameron Cross, a character with such depth, complexity, and untapped potential. Dang, dude, you fluff yourself much? There's nothing deep, complex, or untapped about Cameron Cross that movies like Soldier, Universal Soldier, and even Bloodshot haven't already explored. Moreover, this is a guy who cold-bloodedly murdered women and children in his pre-amnesia life and attacks cops in his post-amnesia life. Tell me again why I should care about this guy? The only thing he's got going for him is amnesia, and that's been done to death, by the way. Plus, the only real mystery still worth anything by the end of the story is how our guy ended up an amnesiac in the middle of the street in the first place. But I can't really force myself to care about that when I don't even care about the guy himself. Are we supposed to care because he wears a cross around his neck and ends up kneeling in a church? I think most of us comic book readers have been around long enough to know the trappings of religion alone do not a good person make. Honestly, what this story lacks, and what it really, really needs, is a save the cat moment. That is, a moment where you generate good feelings in the reader for your character, either by figuratively or even actually having him save a cat, or, I would argue, by having him be a cat in need of saving himself. For example, there's a scene in Sylvester Stallone's Rocky where both kinds of save the cat techniques are used at once. Rocky walks a young girl home to protect her and tries to impart some life advice on the way so she'll keep out of trouble. But in the end, she rejects his advice and even insults him. Rocky's demonstration of goodness, followed by getting crapped on for his goodness, makes us empathize with him. And from that point on, you want to see him succeed. This story lacks any such moment, and what's mind-boggling is that the opportunity for such a moment was right in front of us. You could have had the protagonist rescue the woman being mugged, but instead of saving the cat, you had him blank out and flash back to a moment where he once performed the equivalent of clubbing a whole pod of baby seals to death. You had him set the cat on fire, you psychopath! God only knows what you're exposing kids to in your children's books. Now I'm actually glad it's just Lucifer Valentine's apprentices who wrote an all-ages book for Rippaverse. Across the Bear is one of the absolute worst stories in Saints and Sinners #1, precisely because nobody sane would want to bear the cross of such an absolutely reprehensible, unlikable character. If we'd been shown some good aspect of this guy, care for others, respect for authority, some cautiousness with hospital infrastructure, or at least been shown how all the good aspects of him had been artificially suppressed, that would have been one thing. But it's entirely another thing to hand us a guy who seems little more than a live grenade and then ask us to cradle him to our breast. I think we should save our affection for a more worthy character and save any praise for a more worthy story. Okay, folks, welcome to my next review dealing with Rippaverse's first anthology book, Saints and Sinners. Today we're looking at the story, The Weight of Restraint, written by none other than the editor-in-chief, publisher, and creator of the Rippaverse himself, Eric D., which is missing a period here for some reason, July, with interior art from Elias Martins. Eric July, of course, wrote Rippaverse's flagship title, ISOM, which finished its first story arc this year after losing a mere 3/4 of its audience due to boredom and disgust. Eric July has also written 2 unfinished preview stories, Salvage and Sersha, for Rippazine. This story for Saints and Sinners, however, is the first time he's attempted a complete short work. Does he succeed? Let's find out after checking out the variant cover associated with the story. Remember, being an anthology, Saints and Sinners contains 6 individual stories, but only 4 of these stories have gotten their own variant covers. The remaining 2 stories, one of which is The Weight of Restraint, share the mass market cover E that features characters from all 6 stories. The Weight of Restraint subject in particular is this unassuming young man in the back. We first encounter this young man in the exercise yard of the Lone Creek Correctional Facility. The young man is looking completely unprepared for the situation he's in, which is facing another prisoner's shiv, a shiv being a makeshift prison knife. The older prisoner says, "Every day you sit there, judging." Apparently, he thinks the kid has a bad attitude. He also says, "You think you're special because you ain't marked up like the rest of us?" Not sure what marked up means. Does the kid lack scars? Does he have no band-aids like this guy has on his nose? Is the problem that the kid has no tattoos? Can't see how, since I don't see tattoos on any of these guys. In any case, the guy with the shiv thinks the kid's got a superiority complex, so he tries to cut the annoying smirk off the kid's face, and we soon learn that whoever this kid is, he must have always gotten picked for the dodgeball team in PE class because he's expert at avoiding all these knife thrusts. He's not terribly expert at fighting back, though, because the moment he has a chance to land a punch on the guy trying to stab him, he suddenly stops, and it isn't entirely clear whether he stops himself or if some other force within stops him, judging from the look on his face. Maybe he just found out his acceptability is super pacifism, or maybe he's surprised that he somehow knows enough to start that punch in the first place. Maybe he's implanted with skills like some kind of MK Ultra subject. I'll just give you a little spoiler now and tell you that, as with ISOM, we'll spend the entire story wondering what this guy's abilities are, and we'll never find out. The guards finally step in to break up the fight, dealing harshly with both combatants even though the young guy was never really aggressive. Save the cat moment achieved. We now feel sorry for the guy. But instead of staying with the kid and telling us more about him, the story instead yanks us over to the offices of the Judicial Accountability Commission, where a head lawyer is telling his subordinate lawyers not to look at prisoners' convictions too closely. This is mainly a rubber stamp job. When the pep talk, so to speak, is over, all the lawyers start filing out, but one guy named Canehart stays in his seat and gets kind of a warning from the boss not to be overzealous in his duties. It's not clear why Canehart didn't get up and leave with the other lawyers as if he doesn't have his own office or a job to get back to, nor do I see any reason why the head lawyer should think Canehart's lack of get up and go equates to anything like passion. Anyway, Canehart finally does leave the conference room and go to his own office, at which point he logs onto his computer and then tries to access records associated with the file he's been given. But his access has been restricted since his job is really just to rubber stamp cases, not to actually analyze them for procedural errors. A note scribbled on the file, however, leads him to run a fruitless internal Google search. So he gets up from his desk and paces the room thinking. Note that we actually need to be shown his getting up from the desk. We're just simple readers. We couldn't possibly have intuited from his walking around the room that he obviously got up out of his chair first. But that's okay, because Rippaverse will hold your hand. After pacing for a while, he has an aha moment. The email files. Metadata might have a trail. Tell me you don't know what metadata is without telling me you don't know what metadata is. You need actual forensic computer analysts to read metadata. No lawyer is going to know how to do that. But then again, this is the Rippaverse. And in the Rippaverse, what metadata apparently does is enhance your internal Google search so you can squeeze more data out of the company network. Before Canehart can get any further, however, there's a knock at the door, and his boss drops in almost as if he was alerted to Canehart's progress. Could Canehart's superiors be watching him? But no, really the boss is just there to chide Canehart for not leaving at the end of the normal workday hours. Can't stay late and make your coworkers look like slackers, you know. Can't have that in a law firm. After Canehart assures the boss he'll be leaving soon, he does a little more digging and finds out the 17A designation, whatever that means, is being used pretty often. Not feeling safe doing more searches at the office, Canehart goes to Rippaverse's judicial equivalent of a public library and runs some searches on a public computer there to dig up just a skosh more info before he's accosted by a guard for the suspicious behavior of looking up legal stuff on a public computer in a public building. A public building whose express purpose is to provide public computers for people looking up legal stuff. Canehart replies, Just a little homework, if that's all right. And apparently this childish retort is how Fourth Amendment protections are invoked in Rippaverse, Texas, because the guard just lets Canehart go, while Canehart flaunts his freedom by making the L for loser sign on his forehead. Yeah, suck it, loser. Of course, Canehart's facing away from the guard, so yeah, that's brave. One more thing, I have a serious bug up my butt about the contraction all right. It's fine if you use it as an exclamation, like, all right, woo, yeah, all right. Otherwise, use the two-word form, all right. Just a little homework. Is that all right? So Canehart goes home, which, in an Eric July story, always requires multiple silent panels, even if the driver is shown doing nothing but staying hydrated. It happened in ISOM number 1, it happened in ISOM number 2, and it's no different here. You know what would be really nice in silent multi-panel scenes like this? Words. Words that tell us what the character is thinking. That's what actual writers do, Eric. They write words that other people read. So Canehart walks into his house's office. There's a desk with a computer. Note that the computer screen is off. Yet before Canehart even sets his briefcase down and touches the mouse, he's saying, no way. Apparently this guy just psychically knows that when he boots up the computer, there's going to be something wrong. The next two panels are fine because at least Canehart's actually logged into the computer and doing stuff. But this first panel is ridiculous, and it's easy to see what went wrong. No way belongs in the panel where Canehart actually finds out something's wrong. And they pulled it belongs in the panel showing the message he's seeing because those words serve as his interpretation of what's on the screen. So why didn't the editors rearrange the dialogue in these panels correctly? Well, because that would have left this first panel without any dialogue at all. And with Canehart's face out of view, that would have made this panel a complete nothing burger in the extreme. Oh look, he's just standing there, holding his briefcase. How informative. It's basically a panel with no information. Now, the easiest way for any competent editor to fix this, of course, is to simply make the adjustments I noted earlier and then add a new bit of dialogue that makes the first panel interesting or revealing. You could have Canehart say, I better retrieve those records while they're still there, or even, man, I can't wait to get out of this tie. Of course, that would mean going back to this guy and saying, I fixed your script. Can I get a show of hands among the Rippaverse editors willing to do that? Yeah, didn't think so. After realizing the files are gone, Canehart clicks on the super secret hidden backup location where he apparently had stashed a copy of the files, which is literally a directory named Backup. Yeah, because nobody sophisticated enough to be watching his internet searches all day and deleting the cases he's looking up would ever think that a directory called Backup might be something you ought to check out and possibly delete too. But oh ho ho ho, they weren't fast enough for Canehart. His file backups are still there. So he starts looking through these files that are named things like CJ standard command bar system.package and CJ about menu item.package and cryptographer constants.package. This isn't a list of legal documents or judicial case files. These are the real world installation files for an application builder called Dataflex 25.0. Can you not even give us something worthwhile to look at here? I mean, it's not like you've given us anything worthwhile to enjoy so far. Basically, we've watched a prison yard fight where one guy does nothing but dodge, and tagged along as a lawyer chases a file down across 3 computers. This is not exactly riveting stuff. So let's move on to something hopefully interesting then. Canehart breathes a sigh of relief over finding the file backups, and after looking through them a bit says, at least I have one name, one subject. Really? In all these files, there was only one name. Okay. Also, the word one could use some emphasis both times. So what is the one name? Who is the one subject? Or put another way, seriously, who is this guy? That's the question we were asked in the last story in Saints and Sinners, called Across to Bear, where we were teased with an amnesiac's identity. Come to think of it, the first story in Saints and Sinners also revolved around the question, who are these guys? Imagine that. 3 completely different writers created a Who Are You mystery stories for Saints and Sinners. It's almost like working for Rippaverse sucks the creativity and originality right out of you. But let's stop jerking around and get to the point. Who is our mystery subject? Well, you probably guessed by now that it's our boy from the prison yard at the beginning of the story. But again, who is this guy? You're dying to know, right? Drum roll, please. It's Samford Williard. And everybody who's never read the ISOM books just said, who? But if you did read the ISOM books, you know from ISOM number 1 that Samford Williard is Avery Silman's ranch foreman. And if you're one of the only 25% of ISOM number 1 readers who stuck around for ISOM number 3, you also recall that Sam did spend some time in prison. So now that Canehart has connected the dots and located a young Samford Williard in the correctional system, we can assume we're finally going to learn more about Sam's prison history. What's so strange about Sam's case? What was he charged with? Is he actually innocent of the charges? Why is the case sealed? How long did Sam actually spend in jail? Let's turn the page and get those answers. Or not. Welcome once again to Rippaverse's black hole of artistic incompetence, because this is the end of the story. That's right, no mystery solved other than to identify the young kid in prison as Sam. No idea why he's in prison, no idea why the case was sealed, no idea whether Sam's guilty or innocent, no idea whether Canehart gets him out. We don't even get the reach around of a to be continued box, so as far as we know, leaving us hanging like this was the plan all along. Eric's incomplete stories in Ripazines 1 and 2 both ended in similar fashion, by the way. A full stop with no indication the story's only half done. So this particular incompetence from Eric July has been going on for a while now. It's probably obvious to anyone watching that the main problem with The Weight of Restraint is the fact that nothing really changes from beginning to end. When we first meet Canehart, he's a lawyer passionate about truth and willing to dig for answers. In the end, he does get a name, but he's still just a lawyer passionate about truth and willing to dig for answers. We don't even know if he's going to act on the information he's found, which leaves us with Sam still languishing in prison. The story starts with Sam in prison and ends with Sam in prison. When nothing significant changes from the beginning of your story to the end, you may as well not write a story. That's the major irony of Eric July's calling his story The Weight of Restraint. Any hint of an actual story here is crushed under the weight of Eric July's restraining the story from accomplishing anything significant. The story doesn't change things for Canehart. It doesn't change things for Sam. It doesn't teach either its readers or its characters a lesson. So why write the story in the first place? The dedication Eric wrote is certainly no help in deciphering his objective. He says, "The Weight of Restraints is a story I've wanted to tell for a while, with a focus on what happens when certain choices are made that set us on a path we didn't intend to go on." What path is that? We don't actually see Canehart do anything with the information he's received, nor does he suffer any real consequences so far for chasing it in the first place. And in Sam's case, we don't know what past choices put him in prison, and we don't see him make any impactful choices while presently in prison either. Eric also says, "I hope you enjoy this deeper look at one of the most complex minds in the Rippaverse." Whose mind is he talking about? Because it certainly isn't his. Is he talking about Canehart? How can we get a deeper look into Canehart's mind when this is Canehart's first appearance? Or if Eric is talking about Sam, how do we get a deeper look into Sam's mind when he doesn't say or even think a word in this story? Way to make no freaking sense, Eric. So we're left with the sad irony that this story, The Weight of Restraint, contains nothing of any weight to restrain. It's so lightweight it's like a speck of mental dandruff you want to flick off your brain's shoulder. If Eric July ever tries his hand at another short story, I hope he abandons his restraint and writes something that actually has weight. But if he's determined to produce more weightless material, I hope he instead exercises maximum restraint by deciding to write nothing at all. Okay, folks, welcome to my next review dealing with Rippaverse's first anthology book, Saints and Sinners. Today we're looking at the story Bone God by writer Callum Edmunds and interior artist Will Conrad. Callum Edmunds is more famously known as the gamer and podcaster MauLer, and with his podcast bros, he may be at least partly responsible for inventing the term EFAP, meaning every frame a pause, which refers to that podcasting format in which the panel watches a video and pauses the video frequently to add commentary. Will Conrad, on the other hand, is most famous in Rippaverse circles for providing the art duties on Gooding the Polymath, arguably the worst book Rippaverse has ever published, but by no means the worst drawn book. In fact, Will Conrad did such a bang-up job on Gooding's artwork that I actually doubled the book's score just on account of the art alone, raising that score from a 0.5 out of 10 to a 1 out of 10. And Will Conrad brings the heat for this Bone God story, too. His variant cover for Saints and Sinners, for example, which represents Bone God, is so crazy good that I decided I would buy it for my keeper copy of Saints and Sinners and buy the cheaper mass market cover as my copy to tear up for scans. Unfortunately, I hated this story. I hated this story so much that I decided to tear up my copy with the Bone God cover for scans and keep my mass market copy for reading instead. I literally did not want my keeper copy of Saints and Sinners marred by the visual reminder of this dog turd of a story. Oh, you think I'm kidding? This is the Bone God cover to Saints and Sinners, and it's been defleshed. I say all this to hopefully make clear that by and large I do not hold Will Conrad responsible for the farce this story turned out to be. Just from this beautiful first page, you can tell that he's bringing some top-notch talent to this artwork. Starting with the first panel full of stylized flesh and bone letters spelling out the story's title, accompanied by an initial caption leading nowhere. A wish granted, a price of bone. Looking at this double dash, you'd think that this is just the start of something being said. Maybe the beginning of a poem, or maybe something a character in the next couple of panels is saying. But a quick scan of the rest of the page reveals no continuance. So this ends up being just a stylistic blip you scan quickly and forget all about. Getting past the title card, the actual story begins with the door to a temple being blown open so that this party of explorers can enter. This dialogue from the party's leader appears to set the mission parameters. Supposedly, this temple holds the secret of immortality somewhere inside, and if the party finds it, then everyone in the party will live forever. One thing that's a little confusing is, whose temple is it? Does this temple belong to a god? If so, does the god have a name? Apparently, it's a bone god of some sort because that's the title of the story. But we can't really know that because, as a rule, the title of a story is not part of the story. So it'd be nice if within the story itself you'd either lock down the god's nature as a bone god with some explicit details, or at least give us the god's name to hang our understanding on. Without that simple bit of information, the party's leader sounds both informed and ignorant at the same time, kinda like a cross between a rich snob and a street preacher. The other thing I'd like to see locked down is the number of people in the party, because although I count 6 people in this panel, it seems like there have to be at least 2 more in the party, because this guy in the foreground, who looks like he was lifted from some other page and laid down on this panel on account of the weird beige outline that surrounds him, says, "All right, boys." I really hate this contraction. All right, boys, and the use of the word boys while he's looking at the camera should tell us there are at least 2 more men we don't see, raising the party's number to a minimum of 8. Those 8 being the leader's son, a woman, a guy in a British-style pith helmet, a guy in a more American-style hat, this guy who seems like a crew leader of sorts, and 2 or more other guys indicated by what the crew leader guy says. So I'm going to be keeping track, and I'm expecting to see at least 2 more currently unseen party members appear. First panel of the next page, hey, so far so good. I actually count 10 members in the party now. The 6 members previously seen, plus these 4 previously unseen characters, so the party's up to a minimum of 10. Now it's time to attend to what the characters are saying. Crew leader guy says, "This is new," while shining a flashlight ahead of him, but we have no idea what he sees that's new. It looks like he's shining his flashlight on a bunch of rock and nothing more. Pith helmet guy follows up with, "But not insurmountable." What does that mean? What is there to be surmounted? The woman asks, "What's with all the blue?" referring to these blue glowy things that are providing lighting. So are these blue lights the new thing that needs to be surmounted? And if so, why? In the next few panels, we have a mountain of dialogue to read, and before I say anything else, let me just point out that this first dialogue balloon has a punctuation problem. The words breach, power, sacred, lord, walls, and blood should all be in quotation marks, since Pith Helmet Guy is basically listing words that he sees on the wall. Now, I think all this dialogue is intended to build character personalities and help readers get a sense of each party member as a distinct individual. The usual way to do that is to assign characters different job functions or different areas of interest. For example, in the Dirty Deeds story from Ripazine number 3, we were introduced to 6 different characters, each of whom has its own easily understood job function, and each character demonstrates its specialty in the course of the story. Here, however, we find everyone in the party focusing on the same objective and knowing roughly the same things. That doesn't differentiate the characters very well, so we're going to have to dig deeper to find out what qualities distinguish them from one another. Of course, our job would be much easier if we were given some names to associate with these characters. Between these 2 sections, there are 15 dialogue balloons, and there's not a single name in any one of them. Add the prior page's dialogue balloons, and that makes 23. If you want your characters to be memorable, you have to start name dropping as soon as possible, using any differentiating opportunities you can find. For example, in this exchange of dialogue, Pith Helmet Guy demonstrates knowledge while the woman demonstrates ignorance. This is a perfect moment to give them both names, but we get nothing. Likewise, here we have two characters with different approaches to problem solving. The guy in the American-style hat wants to blow up the wall blocking the party's path, while the crew leader guy wants to figure out the mechanism that's supposed to open the wall the way the temple's designers intended. This is another great opportunity to give us names, but again, we get nothing. We finally do get a couple of names in the next panel, but the names aren't paired. We get the name of the guy who doesn't want the wall blown up. He's Mr. Graves. But we don't get the name of the guy who does want the wall blown up. He's still anonymous, and that has the presumably unintentional effect of diminishing this character's standing. If he's not important enough to name at this point, he must not be important at all. Instead, we get the name that belongs to the leader, one Mr. Venosis. Venosis gives the go-ahead to blow up the wall since Graves apparently couldn't get the wall's trigger mechanism to work. Once the wall is detonated, we get our first glimpse of something mysterious in the temple. There's an indistinct figure down the hallway. Graves is apparently the only one who sees it. We can see the thing reflected in his eye as it, moonwalks out of sight. Is moonwalking supposed to be scary? I admit I was shocked the first time I saw Michael Jackson moonwalk, but I wasn't scared. What would have been scarier, I think, is if instead of making the creature or whatever it is visible to the reader would instead see nothing down the hallway, so that all we saw of the creature was its reflection in Graves' eye. Then we would have to wonder if the creature is all in Graves' head. Did Graves actually see something, or is he imagining things? Graves' reaction continues into the next panel, which is a freaking mess dialogue-wise. Graves says, "What the hell was that?" And everyone flat out ignores him. For example, instead of paying any attention to what Graves just said, Pith Helmet Guy says, "You're bleeding, sir," which is something we can't visually confirm. So when Graves replies, "It's nothing," well, yeah, I guess it is, or else we would be able to at least see Graves bleeding somewhere. Why even have this exchange? It would have been one thing had Graves found himself bleeding profusely enough to make dressing his wound a priority over convincing everyone he'd just seen a creature down the hall, but he shrugs off the bleeding as nothing. You'd expect then that he'd keep trying to convince people he'd seen something, but he just stops talking. Mr. Venosis, meanwhile, is off in his own little world. Spoiler alert, he spends most of the story that way. And we still don't get the woman's name, even though now she's reacting in vexation to the leader, whose name we do know. Now this woman gets diminished in importance, just like the guy with the hat did, although the woman will retain some importance just for being the one woman in the party. This sequence of panels, frankly, is where the story lost me. I pretty much gave up here because although most of the characters are talking, their dialogue is so meaningless that you could eliminate 75% of it and lose nothing. The dialogue is bland and tiresome, and it exhausts the reader's patience without coughing up any internal life for any of these characters. Plus, we get no additional names. It's almost like we're purposely being kept distant from these characters. They don't say anything worth getting attached to over, and the lack of names gives the impression that none of them are worth getting attached to anyway. This next sequence of panels could be themed too little, too late. The first problem is that there's too little ground under these characters' feet. These characters are standing upright in relaxed posture as if they each had both feet on level, solid ground. Not really the case, is it? The leftmost guy is standing on the toes of his left foot and ball of his right, and the rightmost guy only has one half of his right foot on something solid. These characters are practically levitating. Real people would walk around a metal grate with enormous holes, not have a floating conversation on it. How did this art mess happen? Maybe someone with artistic chops could chime in here, but I'm guessing that the foreground characters were drawn first and the background was layered in after them and then their shadows were added? I mean, don't get me wrong, it still looks good. You just have to ignore things like physics and gravity. The good news is that this block of panels gives us no fewer than 4 new character names, which is great. Except now we have to mentally back up and associate these names with who these characters have been to us all this time. Willie is the name of the leader's son, whose only job so far is to be his father's admirer. So he's Willie Venosis. Wyndham is the American hat guy who doesn't mind blowing up walls that get in the way. Sarah is the woman's name. Her job is to tear down the leader, apparently. Which makes sense because the leader's son calls her Mom, which means she's apparently the leader's wife, Sarah Venosis. Finally, Stephen is Mr. Venosis' first name. Or maybe it isn't, because Graves, for some reason, thinks Stephen shouldn't be Mr. Venosis' first name. So what does Graves think Mr. Venosis' first name should be? We don't know. The story never tells us. We're only told that Mr. Venosis changed his first name. We're never told to what. And we're also told that he tried to change his wife's first name, too. But we're never told to what. This is ridiculous. How do you just leave this information out of the story? Well, if you're incompetent, like the Rippaverse editors are, you do that by locating the information outside the story, namely in the giant opening blurb that appears on the story's credits page. It's only here that we learn that Stephen Venosis legally changed his name to Adam Venosis. And the good news is that once we know that, we can combine that information with this line about how Venosis thinks the temple represents a new Eden of sorts, and realize that Eden desiring Venosis must have had the bright idea of changing his and his wife's names from Stephen and Sarah to Adam and Eve. The bad news is that readers aren't required to read opening blurbs. In fact, sometimes, especially in Rippaverse's case, it's way better not to read opening blurbs in order to avoid spoilers. For example, the opening blurb of the earlier Saints and Sinners story, A Cross to Bear, tells us that the name of the main character is Cameron Cross, which completely defeats the point of having the main character wake up with no memory of his own name. That's okay, Cameron. We'll remember your name for you, and we won't be surprised at all when your name is revealed at the end of the story. Examples like that are precisely why many comic book readers avoid reading opening blurbs, like I definitely avoided reading this one. But look how much character information this opening blurb contains. When you realize how much character info there is in here, and when you also realize that this information does not also appear in the story, you realize, with horror, that this opening blurb is actually intended to be read first. This opening blurb, which by definition is not required reading, is required reading for this story, because it's only by reading this opening blurb that you get set up with all the information you need to fully understand what follows. None of this information is in the story. You can only get it here. We certainly haven't learned from the story so far that Wyndham, who likes blowing up stuff, is another of Venosis' sons. He's Willie's brother. And all this time, I figured Wyndham was just another one of Venosis' hired flunkies. But no, it's his son. We also haven't learned from the story so far that Adam Venosis and Sarah Venosis are divorced. We have yet to even hear the name Mr. Maps in the story, nor have we seen anyone in the party displaying expert guidance, so it's only process of elimination that allows us to connect the name Mr. Maps with the British pith helmet guy. The story so far also hasn't told us Castor Graves' first name or character background. Clearly, this is all information we were supposed to have going into the story, but that's not how opening blurbs work. An opening blurb is not the opening crawl of a Star Wars movie. It's more like back cover text. You can read it if you want, but if you never read it, that's okay too. The only essential reading is the story inside. So this whole mass of text is optional. It's also huge. Bone God is the only one of Saints and Sinners' 6 stories where there was so much opening blurb text that the list of creators had to be squished up higher, and the page designer squished it in the laziest, fastest way possible, no less, because there's no freaking way the colorist should be getting top billing over the interior artist. Seriously, the designer just took the top half of the creator credits column, shoved that over to the left, and moved the bottom half of the column next to it. It's like the designer read the story and thought, well, it's not like they care about quality, obviously. Why make my life harder? Speaking of the story, let's drag ourselves back to it, where we find Graves continuing to argue with boom-happy Wyndham, whom we now know from the opening blurb is the boss's other son. And I remind you that if you didn't read the opening blurb, then Wyndham just comes across as a combative jerk in Adam Venosis' employ. Maybe Wyndham is a competitor of Graves, who sees Graves as a threat to his business model and methods. You can't possibly know. And without that knowledge, this exchange of dialogue, where Wyndham questions whether Castor Graves is using a fake name, and Graves replies, "Self-awareness really runs in the family, huh, Wyndham," is extremely confusing. What family does Graves mean? If you've read the opening blurb, you know that Wyndham is the son of Mr. Venosis, therefore Graves might have reason to question the veracity of Wyndham's name. But if you haven't read the opening blurb, then this is the very first clue you get that there might be any relation between Adam Venosis and Wyndham. But let's say you're armed with full knowledge from the blurb. It's still hard to fathom why Graves would question whether Wyndham is Wyndham's given name. After all, if Stephen and Sarah were supposed to be Adam and Eve in Venosis' mind, wouldn't Venosis have insisted the boys change their names to Cain and Abel instead of Wyndham and William? MauLer, this is what happens when you try to be clever. By the way, you're missing a comma here. So Wyndham's about to lay into Graves, probably about how stupid their dialogue is, when all of a sudden we get a jump scare as Graves sees a monstrous demon-looking form over Wyndham. Graves reacts at remarkable speed, firing a bullet at the monster. And here I'm thinking, oh my gosh, what if Graves accidentally shot Wyndham here? Like, what if the temple has been playing tricks on Graves' mind all along, and it's going to get him to kill the party members one-on-one? Because that would be scary. But no, Wyndham is fine. He's standing right here, right next to his dad, who scolds Graves for firing a gun in a sacred temple. Not for firing a gun at his son, for firing a gun in a sacred temple. That's what he cares about. Meanwhile, no one's paying attention to the fact that Graves is acting like he saw something and heard something. I mean, this thing made a sound, right? In any case, shouldn't Venosis have at least seen the creature too? He's looking in the same direction Graves is. Why isn't anyone except Graves reacting to the creature's appearance? This is important because if they didn't see what Graves saw, then what they did see was Graves whipping out a gun and firing it over Wyndham's head just to shut Wyndham up. That's so much worse. That says Graves is a crazy loose cannon who'll fire off a gun for no good reason. They should all be tackling him right now, or calling him a psycho at least. William must have seen something because he's trying to explain it away as the trick of the light, although I don't know how a trick of the light would scream like a banshee. But if that's true and all the characters did see and hear something, we should be getting so many other reactions here. We should have characters saying things like, "What was that thing?" or "Did you see that?" or "I saw it too." That's what makes this story so painful to read. These characters don't react to one another properly, and they don't react to their environment properly either. Later, we see the party walk into a room full of skulls and skeletons, and nobody cares. They've just walked into this sort of haphazard mausoleum, and nobody thinks to check the skeletons to see how old they are or how they died. Nobody even slightly freaks out, as if being around skeletons is just a typical thing for them. Nobody even mentions the skeletons. I guarantee you that if you take any eclectic group of people and throw them into a room full of skeletons, at least one person in the group is going to say something about it. Even if it's just to make a morbid joke, like, "Oh, wow, here's a frat party that went too far." But you don't have a group of people walk into a room of defleshed corpses and have zero reaction. You actually have to wonder if Will Conrad just threw in some skeletons and thought, why not realizing that characters would have to react to these. And when the characters aren't failing to react properly to their environment, they're arguing with one another non-stop. This is the most dysfunctional, dislikable bunch of people you could ever throw together in a haunted temple, or anywhere else for that matter. And that makes Venosis' opinion here ridiculous. He talks like the last thing any of them should want after getting the gift of immortality is to be apart from one another. These people can barely tolerate one another for 5 minutes, much less eternity. In fact, Graves decides he's had enough of this farce, so he clandestinely absconds with Mr. Maps and makes a beeline for the temple's exit, leaving the family members to continue on and fend for themselves. The Venosis family isn't completely alone, though. 3 of the 4 anonymous party members from the beginning have apparently been following the whole time and were just patiently holding back while the others were arguing up a storm and firing off an occasional gun. As the anonymous workers and Venosis' sons start tearing down the temple's last interior wall, Venosis realizes that something's off regarding the markings on the walls. The markings aren't saying what he expected them to say. The temple is actually a prison, and it's holding a bone god inside, whatever that is. By the way, if your story contains any sort of mystery, maybe don't make the key to that mystery the title of your story, because that's dumb. So right as Venosis is realizing that maybe continuing any further is a bad idea, the final interior wall is broken down. Suddenly the lights go out, and there's a horrible screeching noise. When the lights come back on, everybody in the temple's inner chamber is getting violently defleshed, except for Adam Venosis, who finds himself standing eye to eye with the bone god as it touches his forehead and pronounces some gibberish over him, ending with the word immortal, which presumably means immortal. So what does this mean? Did the bone god just bestow immortality on Venosis, or was immortal just Venosis' misreading of some other ancient word? Well, let's turn the page and find out. Hey, it's our old friend again. You remember Rippaverse's black hole of artistic incompetence, right? You guessed it, he's here to tell us that this is the end of the story. There won't be any explanation of what happened or any idea of what happens next. So you just sit there and massage your intellectual blue balls while I perform an autopsy on this turkey of a story. I don't know where to begin to tell you where this story went wrong. I think it goes without saying that this story contained no cats worth saving, meaning no characters worth empathizing with. By the end of the story, I would have been completely content if every single character had died horribly because every character was either too aggravating to live or too weak to be worth keeping around. On the technical side of things, we had the obvious blooper of including all kinds of essential information in the non-essential opening blurb, which made the story nonsensical in places to readers who justifiably skipped the blurb. We also certainly weren't helped by characters' lack of realistic reactions to their environments, as well as their stark raving snottiness with one another. I have some questions, too. Like, what was the shadowy presence in the temple, and why did it recede from view? Was the shadowy presence this thing? And whether it was or not, where did this thing go after this scene? And why didn't it ever return? And why was the old man's family defleshed along with the workers, while the old man himself was spared? Or was the old man spared? Maybe he was about to get defleshed, too. Though I'm thinking probably not, on account of Venosis now having a weird eye pupil where the bone god drew part of an arcane symbol on his face in blood. That would seem to indicate Venosis has been changed and made immortal. That interpretation is further supported by that blink and you'll miss it box of text in the very first panel of the story that says, "A wish granted, a price of bone," which implies the old man got his wish at the cost of everyone else's lives. So I'm guessing the old man probably was made immortal. But why him? And for what purpose? The story leaves you with so many unanswered questions that you gotta wonder, why did I even read this thing? But I know why I read this thing. I have to tell you how to fix a story like Bone God so that if one of these stories ever falls into your editorial lap, you know how to make it into something you can proudly publish. The first way you do that is to define your characters and their wants. Let's start by listing our characters. We've got 6 named characters. Here they all are. Adam, formerly Stephen Venosis, is the leader of the group. Sarah Venosis is his ex-wife. Wyndham and William Venosis are their 2 sons. Castor Graves is the crew leader guy. And the guy in the British pith helmet is Mr. Maps. By the way, did you notice how 3 out of the 6 members of the group had their names and identities called into question, but nobody gave a crap about the guy in the group named Mr. Maps? Just sit with that one a while. In addition to the 6 named characters, we also had 4 unnamed workers, so let's add them on a single line. Lastly, we've got our 2 monsters, the jump scare demon and the bone god himself. So let's list each of those. So here are our characters. Now it's time to determine what each of these characters want. Adam Venosis wants immortality, of course, but he also wants to see his family attain immortality too, despite his son William being the only one who's not a backbiting reprobate. Sarah Venosis, being the ex-wife, is only coming because she wants half of whatever Adam finds, as we're told by her son Wyndham, or maybe he's her stepson Wyndham. The good son William calls her mom, so it's hard to tell whether both boys are the natural product of Adam and Sarah, or if Sarah's a stepmom to both of the boys or just Wyndham. That's yet another way the lack of sufficient details in the story fails the reader. Speaking of the 2 sons, Wyndham obviously doesn't want Sarah horning in on whatever he thinks should belong to him, whereas William is the good son and just wants everyone to get along. Castor Graves has an appreciation for ancient architecture and doesn't want to see it unnecessarily damaged. He really should be the hero of this story, but the story botches his potential save the cat moment by giving him a puzzle to solve and having him fail to solve it. If he'd solved it, we could have felt good about how he saved the temple from some unnecessary demolition, but now he's just a sad sack loser. He's not a sadder sack than Mr. Maps, though. Holy crap, this guy is worthless. All he really wants, other than to get paid, is the chance of working with Castor Graves. That's made clear in a couple of panels I didn't have reason to show earlier. The 4 anonymous workers aren't complex, they're just hired help. So we're down to the jump scare demon and the bone god. Neither of these characters are well defined, but I think it's safe to say that although they're both monsters, they're definitely not allies, because a jump scare moment like this would naturally cause most people to turn and run right out of the temple. And since scaring intruders off would ensure those intruders don't come further in and maybe free the bone god, it's highly likely that the jump scare demon is there to keep the bone god imprisoned. The bone god itself, of course, wants freedom, and it's willing to grant someone immortality in exchange for being freed. So now that we have all our characters and motivations defined, what's next? Next, we reduce our number of characters. It's time to trim the fat, because some of these characters are pure bloat. William Venosis is just a goody two-shoes devoid of personality. He doesn't add anything to the group other than to occasionally say, please calm down. Mr. Maps is only there to be three things: a punching bag for Sarah's shrewishness, a suck-up to Mr. Graves, and a British guy. We also don't need the anonymous workers. The only use they have comes at the very end of the story when they help break down the final wall inside the temple with pickaxes. We can just have Wyndham bring down that wall with explosives. So here's our reduced list of characters and their motivations. Next, we need to list the story's major events. So here we go in rapid fire. The party, 6 named characters plus 4 workers, enters the temple. Graves fails to solve the puzzle, so an interior wall of the temple is blasted open. After the wall is blasted, Graves thinks he sees something, but it disappears. The party engages in an argument about fake names. The jump scare demon appears, Graves shoots at it, and it disappears. The party then discovers a room full of skeletons that they completely ignore. Graves takes Maps and leaves the temple. Finally, the Bone God kills everyone remaining except Adam, who is made immortal. Maybe. So here is our list of major plot points of the story. The next thing we need to do is adjust the story to the new list of characters. We only have 4 named characters and no anonymous workers now, so let's just say we've got our party of 4 entering the temple. Maps is no longer in the cast, so let's erase him, and step 4 is done. Next step is to get rid of dumb story events, starting with the argument over fake names. All that later arguing isn't helpful either. And if all the party is going to do is ignore whatever skeletons they find, then let's not have them find any skeletons. So we're down to this concise list of plot points. The 6th and final step is to mix characters and events into a real story. Let's put all our pieces on the board and see if we can assemble these into something. First, I'm going to fold this list of characters into the list of events, like so. Next, I'll get rid of this formerly Steven nonsense, since we got rid of the argument over fake names. I also want to further develop who these characters are and what relationships they have with one another. And I want to be clear that at this point I am rewriting the story. I will take elements that I see in the story that may be being hinted at, but they might not actually be there, so I'm just going to make them there. Some of these elements that I introduce, they're not there at all. They're just what I think is necessary to make the story better. In the story as written, Adam Venosis comes across as a largely self-absorbed character. He spends a lot of time single-mindedly focused on the quest, and an equal amount of time being oblivious to the horrible family dynamic around him. But I do get the sense from these lines that he has some genuine affection for his family, and he really doesn't want to gain immortality if he can't spend eternity with them. So let's make that hinted affection bedrock while also using it as an additional motivation. Adam genuinely loves his family and wants them to become immortal together with him, precisely so that they have all the time in the world to reconcile and become a loving family. How do the family feel about this, though? In the story as written, Sarah Venosis divorced Adam but still has a claim to his future earnings. Or maybe the divorce is ongoing, and that's why she's come along. She doesn't want him finding new assets without her getting her share. Sarah is an unabashed gold digger, and her son, or stepson maybe, Wyndham, knows it. So Wyndham resents her utterly, both because she controls half the trust fund he intends to rely upon, and because he feels she didn't earn whatever she has or stands to get from Adam, which is kind of ironic considering he's a trust fund brat himself, but he does appear to have some skill with explosives, so maybe he thinks that blowing things up is how he'll earn his keep. The problem here is that neither Sarah nor Wyndham are sympathetic characters in the slightest. They're mean and argumentative all the time. So what I'd like to do is soften them up a little so that we don't totally hate them. Sarah should actually have affection for both Adam and Wyndham, but between Adam's obsessive ways and stepson Wyndham's anger at her being his mother's replacement, she wants to remove herself from the family. But the lure of material gain leading to a better divorce settlement compels her to join the quest. Meanwhile, Wyndham is basically a hurt child of divorce. He sees Sarah as having interfered with the relationship between his father and his mother. Whether or not that's true is beside the point. He also wants to prove his worth to his father via his knowledge of explosives. That, of course, puts him in conflict with Caster Graves, who doesn't need much alteration so far as his motivation goes. We know from the story as written that he'd rather attack the challenge of the temple intellectually than by bulldozing through it with explosives, which puts him at odds with Wyndham. But he's not competent enough to solve the temple's puzzles, so Wyndham gets his way and the party, and frankly we readers too, lose respect for Graves. There's also animosity between Graves and Sarah, and Sarah's contempt for Graves is pretty emasculating, eroding our respect for Graves even more. So let's start retooling Graves by having him be competent enough to solve the temple's puzzles, so that he shows up Wyndham and protects the temple from unnecessary damage, which makes him our hero. That's the save the cat moment we need to put us in Graves' corner. Let's also have Graves be somewhat protective and sympathizing where Sarah is concerned, since she's burdened with frayed family relations while being a fish out of water in this temple setting. From there, we can move on to the next plot point, and since we've changed Graves so that he's now competent enough to face the temple's challenges, let's have Graves solve the puzzle that he encounters so that Wyndham is upset that he isn't getting another chance to prove himself useful to his father. Next revision. Having Graves see something that just retreats into the darkness might up the suspense a little, but we're working with a short story here, so we shouldn't waste what limited space we have on mood. So let's combine these two events. Let's say that when Graves solves the puzzle, the wall opens and out from behind the wall comes the jump scare demon. And rather than having the demon momentarily scare the party and then disappear, which makes no sense because it's the demon's job to get rid of intruders, so why would it disappear? Graves shoots the demon dead. Actually, I take it back. This is kind of boring. We need the jump scare demon's attack to have real consequences, something severe enough that once the demon is put down, Graves thinks it's absolute foolishness to keep exploring the temple. Frankly, we need somebody to die. The problem is that because we got rid of all the unnamed workers, we don't have any extra characters we can sacrifice at this point. So let's partially reverse our character list alteration and give ourselves a couple of expendable crew members under Graves' command. Now, rather than having Graves just shoot the creature dead, the creature can kill off the expendable crew members while the rest of the party just barely manages to kill off the demon using whatever weapons they have at hand. Now it's time for Graves to say, "F this noise," and bug out. But in the story as written, Graves secretly ditches the party without telling anyone, and the remaining party members don't even notice when he leaves. That makes Graves look cowardly and uncaring. In our version of the story, he's going to at least try to convince the rest of the party to leave with him, especially Sarah, whom he tries to persuade that she'll get enough in the divorce already, and in any case, material possessions are no good if you're dead. But when everyone else, Sarah included, decides to stay and continue pursuing whatever treasure is within the temple, Graves hightails it while the family stays together. This leaves us with the ending, in which the family's further destruction of the temple/prison frees the Bone God, who in the story as written kills everyone except Adam right before presumably making Adam immortal. Why the Bone God chooses Adam for immortality and kills the rest, we never know. It's arbitrary, and I don't like arbitrariness. So in our version of the ending, let's have Wyndham's ineptitude with explosives result in his and Sarah's deaths, leaving Adam the only person alive in the presence of the newly freed Bone God. The Bone God assembles a monstrous patchwork body for itself from Sarah and Wyndham's corpses, and then it makes Adam his immortal servant. Horrified at his fate, Adam cries, "No, I didn't want to experience immortality alone. I wanted to live with my family forever." The Bone God, speaking from within the misshapen amalgamation of Sarah and Wyndham's parts, replies, "I am your family now." So there we have it, and I know this was a long video, but I went through all this effort in revising MauLer's story because if you're going to be a comic book editor, sometimes that means taking a bad story you've been handed and combing through its rubble for whatever valuables you can find, then taking those good elements and making a real story out of them. Ideally, all this work is done at the start of the process. MauLer turned in his story, and at that point, the Rippaverse editors should have read it, realized it wasn't ready yet, and said, "Okay, let's work on this." Then they would all put their heads together and make MauLer's first draft into a finished product that's actually worth publishing. Unfortunately, that didn't happen here, and because Rippaverse is concerned far more with crapping out as many books as possible than with producing works of quality, Bone God ended up containing only the barest bones of a decent story. Okay, folks, welcome to my next review dealing with Rippaverse's first anthology book, Saints and Sinners. Today we're looking at the story, The Underdog, written by the Soska Sisters, the writers of several other Rippaverse titles, including Yaira and Bloodruth, and drawn by Cliff Richards, who famously supplied the art for Isom, Rippaverse's flagship title. The cover associated with The Underdog is the mass market cover, and the character we're to be concerned with here is the large buff individual in the back whom early Rippaverse fans might recognize as Larry Shungite, the former Southern-style Wrestling League champion who was right in the middle of calling out the wrestler who took the title from him when the scene abruptly changed on us. Finally, we're going to get to see who beat Larry Shungite and see how the story continues from there, right? No, because that would have been the interesting thing to do. Instead, we're going into the past and starting with the story of wrestler Big Tuna Calhoun, another character we've encountered in Rippaverse's present day, as he is the gang boss the Horseman encounters in his first Fluorspark adventure. In fact, the Soska Sisters revealed in a live stream that they were inspired to write this Big Tuna prequel after reading Horseman writer Chuck Dixon's description of Tuna Calhoun. Specifically, Sylvia Soska said, "Chuck already set us up for the story. I remember reading Tuna's description saying he looks like a former wrestler, and I was like, oh, former wrestler who let himself go. That's interesting. That means he probably was a wrestler. What if we explored that?" And that actually is not a bad idea, if the Soskas were to run with that idea by itself, making Big Tuna the star of the story and chronicling his fall from wrestling grace and his rise in the underworld's ranks. That might have been an interesting story. The problem with the Soska Sisters, however, which is something I've chronicled in my reviews of their Bloodruth #1 and their Catch and Kill story in Ripazine #4, is that they haven't yet begun to master the art of letting one good idea take center stage and play itself out. They have to jam every possible idea they have into each story as if that story might be the last thing Rippaverse ever publishes. Which is why Sylvia continues, and then Lincoln Eusebio has some kind of connection to the SSWL. What could that possibly look like? And Shungite obviously has some kind of reputation within the league. How did he get that? What exactly happened there? So you can already see multiple ideas getting squeezed into this short story. Suffice it to say that by the time the Soskas are done overstuffing their original idea, the story will have morphed from being the origin of Tuna Calhoun's mob career, something that actually might have been interesting, into a story about how Larry Shungite broke into the big leagues by defeating Tuna. Something that I can't fathom would interest any longtime Rippaverse readers because we already know how both Larry Shungite and Tuna Calhoun turn out. Larry Shungite ends up losing his title and becomes a whiny shadow of himself on TV, and Tuna Calhoun ends up drowned in his own swimming pool by Rippaverse's idiot villain duo Michael Copper and Lillian Renashi. Consequently, this story, The Underdog, is a complete waste from the get-go, just like it was a complete waste for Chuck Dixon to have gotten rid of this perfectly good villain character who could have popped up and bothered Horsemen again and again from time to time. By the way, where was it ever established that Lincoln Eusebio has some connection to the Southern Style Wrestling League? He watched it on TV once, and that's it. There's no reason to think he might be anything other than a fan at best. It actually puts a little bit of a strain on the Rippaverse timeline to make Lincoln Eusebio, who's here on the left, the business partner of Genghis G. Gao, who is apparently the father of Gang G. Gao, the publisher of the newspaper that reporter Winslow Valiant works for in Ripazine #4's Catch and Kill story. Now I'm having to wonder just how many years stand between this story and the present day, given how Tuna has changed so much and Lincoln doesn't look like he's changed at all. I'm also wondering just how young a newspaper publisher Gang G. Gao must be. Then again, it's possible that Gang is Genghis's brother, not his son, so maybe The Underdog is a more contemporary story than I thought. It's hard to say when the Rippaverse doesn't really tell you anything. Timeline/family issues aside, let's back up and get into the story. Tuna Calhoun is the reigning SSWL champion, but he's brutally hard on his opponents, putting so many of them in the hospital that no one in the SSWL wants to take him on in their big Summer of Smash event. So Lincoln Eusebio contracts with this female wrestler named Robin to go find some outsider to wrestle Tuna for the championship title at Summer of Smash. Robin is soon made aware of backyard wrestler Larry Shungite, son of her former trainer Anthony Diamond Shungite. Impressed with Larry's latest backyard win, Robin immediately offers him the chance to wrestle Tuna, and Larry immediately accepts. However, Shungite soon learns that he's supposed to throw the fight so Tuna can retain his championship. But Shungite seems okay with that. In case you weren't aware, while pro wrestling is real in the sense of the enormous amount of suffering wrestlers undergo for the sake of entertaining their audiences, it's nevertheless fake in the sense that match outcomes are predetermined. So Shungite's acceptance of his impending loss is professional behavior, and on that basis we should actually think more of him rather than less of him for being so acquiescent. Of course, before Shungite can officially be offered the job, he has to prove his showmanship skills in a sparring match, which he does by literally falling on his opponent. Spectacularly impressed by Shungite's mad use of gravity, Gao confirms the job offer. If you haven't fallen asleep by now, you probably will during this god-awful flirting session between Shungite and Robin, which reveals nothing about either of them. The next day, Shungite shows up to rehearsal ready to do his best, but Tuna isn't even interested in rehearsing. He knows he's slated to win, so why bother with it? Besides, Shungite's a nobody, so Tuna won't even stoop to rehearsing with him. Shungite is personally offended by the brush-off, and you can almost see the wheels turning in his head as he's obviously considering going off script. It doesn't help that Gao refuses to take Shungite seriously either, as he not only dismisses Shungite's chances of a future with the SSWL, but has also decided to give Shungite the insulting nickname the Underdog for this match, which fiercely chafes Shungite's pride. At this point, even if you didn't read ISOM number 2, you figured out exactly what's going to happen next. Of course, first we have to see Shungite agonize over his decision with the help of a couple of supporting characters like Robin and his dad, right? Nope. We jump right to the championship match, which begins with Tuna getting the upper hand right away, putting Shungite in a sleeper hold, which Shungite kicks his way out of. Don't ask me to explain how that's physically possible, because I suspect it's not. It is possible that Tuna still believes at this point that Shungite will still adhere to the script so that he's okay with letting Shungite go for now, but Tuna's not the kind of wrestler who sticks to the script himself, so that rationalization rings hollow. I think we're supposed to believe Shungite actually broke free here, honest and for true, no matter how implausible that is. In the end, it's Shungite who gets the upper hand and puts Tuna in a sleeper hold. The referee counts Tuna out, and that's the match, which makes absolutely zero sense. For one thing, referees don't do 3 counts on sleeper holds. A sleeper hold is different from a pin. For another thing, the referee is in on the match's script, so he's aware that Shungite is supposed to lose. There's no way that the referee would give the match to Shungite contrary to the script without displaying considerable confusion. Note also that it looks like Shungite actually rendered Tuna unconscious, and if this is the case, then what we should have seen here is the referee picking up Tuna's hand and letting it drop 3 times, or at least once, to verify Tuna's loss of consciousness, at which point the referee would have called the match. But this still would have been off script, so the referee should still have looked extremely confused over the proceedings. Expecting to be unceremoniously shown the door, Shungite quickly grabs a microphone and rubs the boss's noses in his victory. And Gao is initially outraged, but Eusebio informs Gao that the ratings for this Summer of Smash are higher than they've ever been. So the two of them decide to offer Shungite a contract. And because Rippaverse is by and large really bad at ending stories, this is the last panel we're given. Shungite walks away thinking he's out of the business, and we're left to imagine Robin chasing after him and offering him a contract so that he turns right back around. So what went wrong? I already mentioned that too many story ideas were combined here. First, we had the idea of seeing Tuna Calhoun go from pro wrestler to mob boss. Next, we had Larry Shungite's ascension to champion status. And as a supporting idea, we had some elaboration of Link and Eusebio's relationship with the SSWL. Any one of these 3 ideas could have fueled a short story in itself, but no. The Soskas had to stuff all 3 of them into one story that ended up feeling like a big heap of nothing. And one major reason it felt like a big heap of nothing was the complete lack of moral conflict. What is driving Larry Shungite's decisions in this story? Basically, the major decision he makes is the result of the disrespect he receives from Tuna and Gao. They both treat him like he's a dish rag they plan to use once and throw away. This hurts Shungite's pride, and it's mostly this one factor that causes him to flip the script and go all out to win. I say mostly because there is a small hint of a more nobler motive. In part of his impromptu acceptance speech, Shungite tells the audience, which in this panel includes kids, that they deserve a better champion than an arrogant, entitled, bloated lapdog. And this harkens back to an earlier scene where Shungite demonstrates the enormous power he possesses as a role model for his nieces and nephews, convincing them to change their eating preferences just so they can be more like him. You can see why Shungite might have a moral problem with losing to Tuna then, because it would mean Tuna would gain more power than Shungite has to influence Shungite's nieces and nephews and all the other children out there in the audience. But we never explicitly see Shungite wrestle with this concern, nor does he ever argue with Tuna about the responsibility they have as role models. There's a chance for real philosophical conflict between Shungite and Tuna here that's completely overlooked. And this leads into the third thing that's really wrong with this story. No strong relationships. Just as the opportunity to establish a real antagonistic relationship between Shungite and Tuna is passed over, so are any opportunities to have other characters develop supportive relationships with Shungite so that Shungite doesn't spend most of the story with his thoughts locked up inside his head. For example, we have the god-awful flirting between Shungite and Robin. Why not use this scene as a way for Shungite to express his concerns? I don't even know enough about Robin as a character to guess how she'd react to anything Shungite has to say. That's how flat and lifeless a character she is. What about Shungite's father, who obviously trained Shungite? Would he agree with Shungite's concerns about having a heel like tuna at the top of the wrestling food chain? Or would he tell his son, that's the way it is in the business. Sometimes a heel like tuna is top of the heap. Just don't break kayfabe, whatever you do. In other words, don't risk spoiling the audience's belief in the match by going off script. Last but not least, we don't see any real difference between Eusebio and Gao as business partners, and despite Sylvia Soska's wanting to explore Eusebio's relationship to the SSWL, nothing is revealed in that area aside from Eusebio's part ownership. What if Eusebio were to treat Shungite better than Gao? What would that mean so far as Shungite's decision goes? Would he develop some loyalty to Eusebio that might sway him to stay on script? There's all this untapped potential spread throughout The Underdog, resulting in a completely bland story that fails to satisfy in any dimension. It's bad enough it's a story about wrestlers in a universe full of superheroes. That alone would be enough to make the story itself an underdog, struggling to make its banal contents relevant or exciting in a book full of superheroics and mysticism. Unfortunately, thanks to all its super deficiencies and missed opportunities, this story is no underdog. It's just a dog. Okay, folks, welcome to my 6th and final review dealing with Rippaverse's first anthology book, Saints and Sinners. Today we're looking at the story One Little Push, written by Will Jordan, the movie critic and filmmaker also known as The Critical Drinker, and interior artist Carlos Renaud. Here we have the variant cover associated with the story, which is probably the most boring of the 5 covers we've seen for this book, which makes it crazy that this was the cover Rippaverse chose to make the expensive foil embossed cover that you could pick up for a premium price. You can't even really tell what's going on here. Is this a guy taking a photo of Yaira's butt? Or is he looking through a sniper sight at Isam's sister? Wouldn't a sniper sight display some kind of crosshairs? We'd better just move on to the story. We open with a guy in a trench coat saying, "You think you know me, you don't." Well, unless you're a Rippaverse character we've seen before, I can't see how I could think I know you. Maybe you could tell me your name? The shadowy character continues on with some flowery, vague text, and at the end of it all I'm thinking, nope, still not placing you. Maybe you can elaborate some more? Oh, good, he elaborates some more. This part I'll read. "The thing is, it might surprise you to know that I take no pleasure in what I do. Repeat any task enough times, and you just stop thinking about it. It becomes as natural as breathing. And in the end, it's better that way. Better not to get involved. Better not to unbalance the scales." So his accept power is super apathy? Because not only does he sound completely bored, he's also just letting this mugging happen. Oh, hold on a minute. Is this that Cameron Cross guy from the earlier Saints and Sinners story Across to Bear? Because he let a mugging happen there too. Seriously, you'd think the Rippaverse editors might spot the fact that the same act of ignoring a mugging occurs in 2 different stories in the same book, and maybe try to vary things up a little. Maybe in this present story we can show a mother roughing up her kid, or if the point is to show a life-threatening situation, show a near-miss car crash. I know it's hard to coordinate this kind of stuff across stories in an anthology, but readers will notice repetition. Finally, Trenchcoat Guy says, "But sometimes, just sometimes, I make an exception." And by the logo on the building, it looks like his target is Elon Musk. Okay, I know you now, dude. You're Luigi Mangione, aren't you? You shot that United Healthcare CEO, and now you're coming for Elon Musk. But before we can get that ID confirmed, we switch to somebody else's internal monologue. This guy in shades is approaching ISOM villain Darren Fontano's Club Merc and telling us, "Killing is all about preparation. After all, it's not every day you're asked to kill a god." Okay, the second sentence does not logically follow from the first. When someone says, "after all," you expect the next thing said to explain the previous thing said, like, "Killing is all about preparation. After all, you have to plan a safe approach, choose a weapon, plot an escape route, etc., etc." What you wouldn't expect is for him to say, "Killing is all about preparation. After all," and then describe something he doesn't normally do, which is kill a god, apparently. Something that I admit is going to be hard since the only accept power this guy has displayed so far is super non-sequiturs. So the guy has a sit-down with Darren Fontano, flanked by Fontano's flunkies. Try saying that 3 times fast. And the two of them proceed to have one of the most unintentionally ironic exchanges of dialogue in Rippaverse history, as Darren insists on knowing the new character's name right away, even though Rippaverse made us wade through about 140 pages of ISOM before we learned Darren Fontano's full name. That's right, for 1.5 issues of ISOM, Darren Fontano was just Darren, as if saying Darren in the Rippaverse was like saying Prince in our world. On top of that, this guy that Darren is hiring decides that he's going to call himself Kane. Why was this name something the Rippaverse editors should have caught and fixed? Well, if you've read Bloodruth #1, you'd know that the biblical Cain has a role to play in the origin of Bloodruth. So now we have to wonder whether this guy is the actual Cain who's related to Bloodruth, or whether he's maybe just the member of an order of Cain that may or may not be associated with the lineage of the real Cain. He also could be neither of those things, but the point is the editors should have known better than to allow the character a name that already carries meaning within the Rippaverse. Give the guy some other name that won't cross the streams and splatter the reader with distracting name associations. But for now, Cain it is. As Cain hinted earlier, Darren actually does want Cain to kill a god, and the god in question turns out to be Yaira. Why does Darren want Yaira dead? Because Darren thinks Florespark fears Yaira more than they fear him. Cain agrees to do the hit, but just like in the previous Saints and Sinners story, The Underdog, where Larry Shungite had to prove to the Southern Style Wrestling League owners that he was enough of a showman/athlete to take on a match, Cain has to prove his hitman credentials against Darren's flanking flunkies. Cain acquits himself admirably, speedily killing both henchmen, and then Cain kind of gushes a little over Darren, saying, "The man was willing to sacrifice 2 of his own men just to test a theory. What kind of monster was I dealing with?" Monster is not the word I would have used. I would have used the word moron, for reasons you'll see shortly. Released into the wild to do his job, Cain decides that since Yaira has ice powers, her weakness must be heat, so he procures a sniper rifle capable of firing incendiary rounds. That's pretty much the whole plan. Find Yaira and shoot her with a heat bullet. Now we can get back to why Darren is a moron. Note that Darren asked Cain to kill Yaira, but Darren never made any stipulation that Cain had to do it via close quarters combat, which is why Cain feels free to go with a sniper rifle. So why did Darren feel the need to test Cain's close quarter combat skills if he didn't care whether Cain would use close quarter methods to kill Yaira? He's making sure Cain has skills he might not even need. Moreover, why did Darren waste 2 perfectly good henchmen on this test? I mean, I assume these henchmen were useful, capable killers, or else what good of a test would it have been? Darren's not a monster. He's an idiot who needlessly wastes valuable resources. Anyway, once Cain accepts the moron's mission, he does a little computer research, hoping to connect some dots and get a lead on Yaira's whereabouts. Cain already knows, thanks to Darren, that Avery Silman fought Yaira, so he looks up Avery's family and learns that Avery's sister Altona works for Projexis, and oh look, there's Yaira. Yeah, it was that easy. It was so easy, you have to wonder why Darren didn't just figure out Yaira's identity himself and communicate her identity to the police so that she'd have to leave Florespark for the next few decades while she built herself a new identity. But that would require Darren not be a moron, so tough luck there. Cain does some further observation and discovers that Yaira has a daily coffee routine, so he finds himself a good vantage point across from the Projexis building and settles in to wait. Notice that the Projexis building is the same building that was being scouted on page 1 by the trenchcoat guy we've all forgotten about by now. What a coinkydink! Inside the building, we find that Will Jordan is absolutely in love with internal monologues because he starts a brand new one showing us Yaira's thoughts, describing how she's had this feeling all morning something's going to happen. And there's no proper word in human or even in Yaira's language to describe that feeling of anticipation of something coming that you can't quite see. Premonition. You're having a premonition. That's literally the word for it. Yaira is like centuries old, but somehow she missed that particular English word. Her monologue concludes, "I need to get outside, to get some air," as if she wasn't already planning to go outside. Will, you just told us this is what Yaira does every workday. She doesn't need another reason to go out. Consequently, this whole internal monologue is completely unnecessary. We also see that Trenchcoat Guy is right here in the lobby watching Yaira, so if you think this panel is in dire need of internal monologuing, just resume this guy's monologue. From behind Yaira, a voice calls out to her, addressing her by her civilian name. It's Avery Selman's sister Altona, asking if she can go with Yaira for coffee. Yaira agrees, and Trenchcoat Guy follows the two of them as they walk outside. Kane immediately spots the two women and sets up his shot, saying, "There she is, right on time, and with Altona beside her. I suppose it's fitting that she should be there to see this." So even though his crosshair is sitting on Yaira's shoulder at the moment, it's clear that his intention is to shoot Yaira dead and have Altona witness it. We're all clear on that, right? He's not aiming at Altona, Yaira is the target, and Altona just happens to be there as a witness. The plan is to shoot Yaira. So Kane takes the shot, and now Trenchcoat Guy takes center stage, monologuing about how he's able to see all possible futures branching from this one moment in time. Now, since Kane's such a great assassin, and since there's nothing going on close enough to interrupt Kane's shot, we can assume the primary future Trenchcoat Guy is seeing is the one where the assassination goes exactly as Kane intended. The bullet blows right through Yaira's brainstem, and the gruesome scene leaves Altona a shrieking emotional wreck standing over the body of her dead friend. Or not! Looks like this future shows Kane missing his shot entirely and killing Altona instead. This well-reputed assassin, having perfectly prepared for his mission and having no obstacles in his way whatsoever, is going to kill the wrong woman. At this point, I want to throw this whole freaking book out the window because I can't endure complete logic vomit like this after already having been abused by its 5 other stories. How on earth does Kane miss this shot? I thought this guy was Mr. Preparation. Are you telling me he didn't test the gun? Did he not make sure it was well maintained and sighted properly? Did he not adjust for using incendiary rounds? Did he not find a suitable patch of real estate somewhere in Texas to practice on? Maybe on a piece of land he had Darren buy for him so he could set up a copycat scene and do dry runs of the shooting. If Kane is everything that he's been cracked up to be, there is no reason he should miss this shot. Now, I could understand if Kane saw Altona and Yaira together and thought, you know what, I'm going to impress Mr. Fontano by giving him a twofer so that he deliberately lined up his shot to take out both women at the same time. Because the angle of the bullet here does seem primed to accomplish exactly that. What I don't see is a hitman with a reputation so impressive that 2 men's lives were needlessly wasted putting that reputation to the test, missing this shot. Trenchcoat Guy is also disgusted by Kane's crappy aim, not because it breaks story logic, but because he foresees Yaira absolutely throwing a fit when Altona dies and racking up a substantial body count of her own after she goes to war with Darren. Apparently, that would result in far more work being put on Trenchcoat Guy's plate than he'd prefer to deal with, though it's still not clear what his work actually is. So Trenchcoat Guy decides he's going to intervene for a change and send the future down a different path. All it takes is clubbing us over the head with the title of the story, beating us with it extra slowly a much-deserved second time because we were too stupid to avoid buying this book in the first place, and using one little push to send that approaching kid on a skateboard smack into Altona, knocking her out of the way of the bullet. A bullet which, by the way, was never going to hit Yaira. I mean, look at this. He wouldn't even have grazed the top of Yaira's head. Kane reacts. It can't be. It was perfect. No, it wasn't. Literally, the best you were going to do was hit the wrong woman. You suck at this. Kane beats feet for the elevator, moping about all the planning and preparation he'd put into being a ridiculously lousy shot, only to be met at the elevator by his super pissed off target, who, by the way, has the power to fly but instead took the elevator. Obviously, the writer thought their meeting like this would look cooler, despite making no sense. Now, pop quiz. How does Yaira dispose of Kane? Does she A. drop him on a car, B. turn him over to young black detective Mick Davies, C. turn him over to old white detective Mick Davies? Seriously, they both still exist. D. freeze his body solid and then shatter it, or E. punch his heart out through his spine? I'll give you just a moment to choose your answer. If you said D, freeze his body solid and then shatter it, you're wrong. She drops him on a car, which is only the most Yaira thing ever. Okay, technically this time she blasts the guy out of a window instead of straight up tossing a guy away. But come on, dropping a guy on a car is not a power set. What would you even call that power set? Automotive impaction? Also, do you remember what I said about readers remembering repetition across stories in an anthology? The same thing applies to repetition across books. You need to not have your characters do the same thing over and over in your comic book universe. The last thing we see as the story concludes is Trenchcoat Guy walking away all pleased with himself, saying, "No rest for the wicked," as the saying goes. You think you know me. You don't. You still haven't told us your name, dipwad. Why should we think we know you? The crazy thing is that despite this story's huge and incredibly frustrating flaws, One Little Push is one of the better stories in this lackluster volume. Honestly, it wouldn't take too many changes to set things right with it. First, have Darren bring the assassin, who needs to be named something other than Kane, out to a shooting range and test him by forcing him to make a long-distance sniper shot or be killed by Darren's men. He makes the shot and proves himself to Darren. That way, Darren isn't testing the assassin for skills beyond what'll be needed and doesn't waste any of his own men's lives in the testing. And if you really want to make Darren seem like a monster, have the target be a puppy or something. Second, have Darren already know Yaira's identity and hand it to the assassin on a platter. This will strengthen Darren in the eyes of the reader. Have Darren explain that he wants the Yaira problem solved not to make people more afraid of him than they are of her. That's a stupid reason to risk attracting her attention his way. But because he doesn't want Avery recruiting her someday. He knows how these Excepts sometimes fight each other but then team up. Plus, he also wants the chance to hurt Yaira's employer, Lincoln Eusebio, by robbing Eusebio of star employee Sally Rodell in recompense for Lincoln's disrespecting him. That'll make sense of the sniper's idea to take out both Yaira and Altona at once, since he figures his taking out two of Lincoln's employees will be even more satisfying to Darren Fontano than his taking out just one. Third, Trenchcoat Guy needs to have a name and a clear purpose. I get the impression that he's supposed to be the personification of death, but that doesn't make any sense because there's no reason for death to want to save anybody rather than take their lives. We need some real explanation for why this guy intervenes to save both Yaira and Altona. It could be that although he's okay with hitmen in general, he's offended by the notion that this particular hitman is willing to take an extra life for free. Whatever the reason, there needs to be a reason. Finally, this goofy elevator sequence needs to be replaced by something more believable, like a mad dash down a stairwell that brings him face to face with a flying Yaira. And our guy definitely does not need to be dropped on a car. Just have him splatter on the sidewalk, especially since it looks like, according to the text, that's where he was supposed to end up in the first place. Or if he absolutely positively has to land on a car, at least have Altona say something funny, like having her ask Yaira, "Is this just something you do?" As you've just seen, it only would have taken a few little pushes to make One Little Push the best story in Saints and Sinners #1. Unfortunately, the editors at Rippaverse are too weak to apply even that minuscule amount of force. Speaking of best story, just how would I rank the stories in Saints and Sinners? Well, at the bottom of the pile comes the woefully incomplete Across to Bear by J. David, aka Drunk 3PO. His titular character Cameron Cross, not to mention every single other character in the story, comes across as flat and uninspired. This story was so dead inside I didn't even bother trying to find a way to breathe life into it. Next up is Eric July's The Weight of Restraint, which has the distinction of being simultaneously the most original story concept in the book and the only non-story in the book. The only thing worse than finishing it and finding out nothing of consequence happens is dreading what new territory of stepping on rakes Eric might take it into if given the opportunity. Next up is the Soska Sisters tribute to pro wrestler Larry Shungite, the Underdog. It's absolutely stunning how this pair took 3 good fan service ideas and incorporated all of them into a single tale that absolutely no fans wanted or needed. I'm pretty sure I could make this into a good story. I'm much less certain that even a good version would be worth anyone's time. Next up is Bone God by Callum Edmunds, aka MauLer, whose mostly self-absorbed, mean-spirited, abrasive, and/or stereotypical characters are even more stomach-turning than the final flood of gore he unleashes. Reviewing this story was a soul-sucking experience, and the only reason it ranks so highly is that there's actually the kernel of a decent story with potential in there. Maybe something that could have fueled a Bloodruth arc someday, though I doubt the company will last long enough to bring that idea to fruition. In second place, we have this video's subject, One Little Push by Will Jordan, aka The Critical Drinker. This story had a couple of major logic gaps, but if these problems had been caught and fixed before publishing, the story would have easily been the best in the book. However, that distinction goes to HeelVsBabyface's Chasing Ghosts, which does have plenty of flaws, but also has two major good points going for it. First, it was a solid enough story that, if you wanted to, you could actually turn off your brain and just try to enjoy it. Second, it's the only story in the book that introduced new characters interesting enough to be transitioned into their own book, namely the supernatural paramilitary team called the Ghosts. There's a backstory there that I think Eric would do well to let HeelVsBabyface explore in a standalone book next year, assuming Rippaverse lasts that long, of course. Having reviewed all 6 stories in Saints and Sinners #1, it's finally time for the overall score. Here are the books I've previously reviewed, and we're going to have to open up a new score entry for Saints and Sinners #1. This one's getting a 1.5 out of 10. This book was an absolute cavalcade of suckage from writers who are supposed to be either well-reputed critics of one or more entertainment genres or experienced comic book writers, and amazingly, neither of these credentials helped them one bit at giving us decent stories. If it weren't for HeelVsBabyface's contribution, this book would have scored alongside Gooding the Polymath as Rippaverse's worst offering yet. Speaking frankly, Saints and Sinners is a collection of some of the worst stories Rippaverse has ever told. I wish I could say it's not too late for Rippaverse to recommit themselves to telling only the best stories possible, something they have never actually achieved, but at least at one time they aspired to do so. Back then, Rippaverse was still flush with its initial success and didn't need to stoop to chasing prominent YouTubers' audiences with the goal of vampiring some new blood into their reader pool. But bad book after bad book has bled Rippaverse out until now the whole company is engaged in just keeping their hamster wheel of suck spinning. And it's going to take a lot more than one little push from me or anyone else to divert them onto a road that leads to quality. Thank you for watching. I'm Mike Partika, and if you found the information in this video helpful, please hit like and hype if it's available to put it in front of more people's eyes. Also, if you haven't followed me on each of these platforms yet, I urge you to do so. You never know when the ban hammer's going to fall on my YouTube channel the way it fell on my X account. So here are multiple ways you can keep current with me if something bad happens. Plus, I occasionally publish content exclusively to Rumble and BitChute. I've also got a Blue Sky account now, so feel free to check me out there too. For my next review, I'll be looking at recent TikTok star John Delarose's latest comic. It's the 3rd volume in his Terran Imperium series, The Emerald Array. After that, I'll be reviewing the conclusion of the Yaira trilogy, Yaira #3. I've been looking forward to this one, largely because I'm hoping it'll explain the incoherent middle and ending of Yaira #2, which I'll also be touching on in that review. So make sure you're subscribed so you can be notified when these reviews drop. Once again, I'm Mike Partika, thank you for watching, and I will talk to you later.